Winter on the frontier had a reputation for being cruel, but this year it seemed almost vengeful. The early mornings were colder, the wind sharper, the skies constantly shifting as if planning something. Folks in town whispered that a hard storm was coming, but no one expected it to rise so suddenly or with such fury. Caleb Rowan, a cowboy known for his reliability rather than his luck, had just finished delivering a bundle of supplies to an elderly couple living 5 miles outside of Briar Creek. He'd taken the job because the pay was decent and because he had a soft spot for people who reminded him of his grandparents. Now, with the chore done, he was heading home, hoping to reach the bunkhouse before nightfall. But the sky had other plans as Caleb rode across the open stretch of prairie. The horizon darkened with a heavy bruise-colored cloud. He narrowed his eyes, uneasy. Snowstorms usually announced themselves with hours of warning-thin wisps of frost, a whisper of wind, a shift in the smell of the air. This storm rushed in like a beast, wild and unrestrained. The temperature dropped so fast his breath turned instantly to ice. His horse, Dusty, snorted and pawed anxiously. Caleb patted the gelding's neck, trying to steady him, though his own pulse had started to race. Within minutes, snow began to fall, not gently as it had the night before, but in hard, stinging pellets that slapped against his face. The wind rose next, howling across the land like a chorus of wolves. The world turned white in every direction, the prairie swallowed by swirling curtains of snow. Caleb leaned low over Dusty, guiding him with practiced hands, though his visibility had shrunk to barely a few feet. He'd grown up in this kind of weather. He knew how deadly it could be, how easy it was to lose direction, how quickly a man could freeze if he stopped moving. Survival meant staying calm, keeping focused, and reaching shelter before the cold claimed him. Even so, he felt a coil of fear tighten in his gut. The storm was moving too fast, unnatural in its strength. Then, through the roar of the wind, he heard something. At first, he thought it was a trick of the storm. The way blizzards often created illusions, voices that weren't real, shadows that weren't there. But then it came again, a cry. Faint but unmistakable, someone was out there. Caleb pulled Dusty to a halt, one gloved hand cupped around his ear as he strained to listen. The cry came again, swallowed quickly by the wind, but still undeniably human. Someone was calling for help weakly, desperately. Everything in Caleb's body told him to turn back. He was already fighting the cold, his clothes heavy with wet snow, his skin burning with the sting of frost. He didn't know the land well enough in this direction to risk wandering blindly. One wrong choice could kill him, but he couldn't ignore a cry like that, been raised on simple rules. Never turn away from someone in need. Never leave a soul behind if you can help them. Frontier life was harsh enough without abandoning those caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Easy, boy, he murmured to Dusty, turning the horse toward the sound. Just a little farther. He pushed deeper into the storm, following the faint cries, his own heartbeat pounding louder than the wind. Visibility dropped to nearly nothing. Snow lashed against his eyes. Dusty struggled forward through drifts, climbing to his knees. Then Caleb saw it, just a shape at first, dark against the endless white. A figure on the ground, curled in the snow, unmoving. His breath caught whoever they were. They wouldn't last another minute in that cold. And in that instant, Caleb Rowan made a choice that would change his life forever. Asterisk. Caleb slid off Dusty so fast his boots sank instantly into the knee-deep snow. The wind cut through his coat like a blade as he knelt beside the fallen figure. At first glance, he could barely tell if the person was alive. She was covered in white, her face pale, her breath shallow and uneven. Only her trembling fingertips, barely visible through her torn glove, proved she hadn't succumbed yet. He brushed snow off her shoulders and saw long dark hair crusted with frost. A woman. Her eyes were closed, lashes frozen together. Her coat, expensive-looking but ripped from some accident, hung off her frame in tatters. It looked like she'd been thrown from a horse or dragged by one. "Ma'am?" he said, not sure if she could hear him over the storm. "Can you hear me?" Her lips parted, the faintest whisper escaping. "Cold." Then nothing more. Caleb felt the bottom of his stomach drop. She was hours, maybe minutes, from freezing to death. He couldn't stay out here long enough to examine her injuries. Every second mattered. He lifted her carefully, startled at how light she was. The storm howled harder, as if trying to rip her from his arms. Caleb shielded her with his body and boosted her onto Dusty's saddle, keeping one arm around her limp form to hold her upright. "Stay with me," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if she could hear. "I've got you." He needed shelter, any shelter, and fast Caleb swept the storm-shrouded horizon with his eyes, searching for something familiar. He'd passed an old trapper's cabin earlier that day, a half-forgotten place used more by coyotes than men. If he could find it again, they would have a chance. If not, he didn't let his mind finish the thought. He tugged Dusty's reins and guided the horse through the blizzard. The wind was blinding, the snow piling thick and heavy, but he pushed forward by instinct and memory. Dusty was shivering beneath him. The animal knew the danger too. After what felt like an eternity, 15 minutes, maybe 30, Caleb spotted a dark outline through the swirling snow. The cabin. Or at least something with walls. Relief nearly buckled his knees. He urged Dusty onward, stopping outside the sagging door. Caleb lifted the woman back into his arms, careful of her head and limbs, and kicked the door open. The cabin was dark, cold, smelling of old wood and dust, but it was shelter. That was enough. He laid her gently on a pile of old blankets he'd once used as a bed on a similar trip. Then he rushed to the stone hearth and struck a match. The fire resisted at first, the wood damp from years of neglect. But finally flames caught and spread. Warmth, weak but growing, began to fill the room. Caleb turned back to the woman, peeling off her frozen gloves, rubbing her hands to bring circulation back. Her fingers were stiff, nearly blue. Her cheeks red from windburn. He dipped a cloth in a pot of warming water and touched it gently to her skin. Minutes crawled by before she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, confused, filled with pain and disorientation. She looked at him, blinking slowly, as if trying to piece the world back together. "Where?" she whispered. "You're safe," Caleb said softly. "Name's Caleb Rowan. Found you out in the snow. You were near gone." Her gaze lingered on him for a long, quiet moment, filled with gratitude. And something guarded. "My name is," she hesitated, "Elena." Just Elena. Caleb didn't question it. He assumed she was a traveler, maybe from one of the northern towns. Her coat and boots were nicer than what folks around here typically wore, but he chalked it up to her being from a wealthier family. It wasn't his place to pry. "You're lucky I heard you," he said, gently tucking the blankets around her. "Storm like this. Another hour and I might have been too late." Elena swallowed, her eyes shining faintly in the firelight. "You saved my life." Caleb shrugged, embarrassed. Anyone would have done the same. But Elena knew not everyone would have risked themselves in a blizzard for a stranger. Caleb didn't know it yet. But the woman he'd rescued wasn't simply Elena. She was the heir to the largest ranching empire in the territory. And this was only the beginning. The blizzard raged for 2 nights, turning the old trapper's cabin into a small island in a sea of white. Wind battered the shutters, snow piled against the walls, and the distant groan of shifting drifts echoed like ghosts moving through the storm. Inside, however, warmth slowly settled, a fragile but growing bubble of safety surrounding Caleb and Elena. Caleb had tended the fire constantly, feeding it scraps of dry wood he found piled in the corner. He made sure Elena stayed warm, wrapped in every blanket he could scavenge. Though her color had returned and her breathing steadied, She was still weak, her face pale beneath the flickering firelight. The frostbite hadn't been severe enough to cause permanent damage, but her hands and feet ached with deep cold. By morning, she could sit up. Caleb cooked a thin stew from the supplies he carried, apologizing for its plainness even though she ate it gratefully. Hunger had softened her pride. Exhaustion had stripped her guard. Yet she still held tightly to one thing, her true identity. Caleb didn't ask who she was beyond Elena, didn't inquire why she'd been alone in such dangerous weather. He wasn't a man who pried into things that weren't his. Life had taught him to treat strangers with respect and to give them space until they were ready to speak. And so the silence between them, initially awkward, slowly became comfortable. As the storm screamed against the windows, they talked quietly beside the crackling fire. Their conversations were simple at first: where they were from, what kind of work they did, what brought them out to this stretch of wilderness. Elena kept her answers vague, describing herself as someone who travels for business, a phrase Caleb accepted without probing, but he talked more openly than she expected. Maybe it was the isolation of the cabin. Maybe the long hours spent together with nothing but wind and darkness outside, or maybe it was the soft, steady way Elena listened, truly listened, that made him open up. He told her about drifting from ranch to ranch, taking whatever work he could find. Told her about his dream of owning a small patch of land someday, nothing grand, just enough to raise a few cattle, a place that belonged to him. He spoke about saving every dollar, about setbacks and lost opportunities, about the years it had taken to get where he was now. Elena watched him with a mixture of admiration and ache. Caleb had a kind of honesty she rarely saw in the powerful men she dealt with, men who ruled from behind desks or board tables, who surrounded themselves with wealth and influence. Caleb had nothing but grit in his pockets and quiet strength in his eyes. Yet he carried himself with more dignity than some men with 10,000 acres, more than once. She almost told him the truth, almost confessed that her last name was Sinclair, that business meant overseeing ranching operations spanning hundreds of miles, that the very land they were sitting on might even belong to her family. But each time she opened her mouth, fear stopped her. She didn't want him to look at her differently. She didn't want to see that shift in his expression, the one she saw so often in others when they realized who she was. Deference, hesitation, distance. Here, in this cabin, with her hair still damp from melted snow and her hands wrapped in borrowed blankets, she was simply Elena, a woman saved by a cowboy who didn't expect anything in return, and she liked it that way more than she could admit. Caleb noticed her guardedness but respected it. He didn't push. Instead, he offered small comforts, an extra blanket, a gentler seat near the fire, the reassurance that the storm wouldn't last forever. Each gesture chipped away at her defenses. At night, the firelight cast warm shadows across the room. Elena watched Caleb as he dozed in a chair near the hearth, hat tilted over his eyes, boots still on, exhausted but vigilant. A man like him deserved a fortune, she thought, yet he had none. She had everything, yet none of it felt as real as this moment of quiet safety. A spark formed between them, not spoken, not acknowledged, but undeniably present. Something fragile, something dangerous, something beautifully unexpected. Neither knew that when the storm finally broke, the truth waiting outside would test that spark to its very core. By the third morning, the world had quieted. The storm that had roared through the night now lay still, leaving behind a heavy silence that felt almost sacred. Snow blanketed the land in untouched white, sparkling beneath the early light like crushed diamonds. The cabin, once rattled by wind, now rested peacefully beneath a sky scrubbed clean. Inside, Caleb packed up the few supplies he had left. Elena, though tired, was strong enough to stand and move about, her color returned, her eyes alert. She seemed almost reluctant to leave the cramped cabin that had become their refuge and something more. But she knew the world outside would demand answers. "Reckon we can make it back to town now," Caleb said as he tightened Dusty's saddle. "Storm's over. Trails'll be tough, but manageable." Elena nodded, pulling her borrowed coat tighter around her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice softer than usual. He smiled, the kind that came easily around her. Just doing what anyone would have done. But she didn't believe that, not for a moment. Caleb didn't understand how many people would have kept riding, pretending they hadn't heard a cry in the storm. They set off together. The world felt eerily quiet except for the crunch of Dusty's hooves breaking through fresh snow. Caleb rode with Elena seated behind him, her hands lightly gripping his coat. She leaned closer than necessary, not from weakness now, but because being near him felt safe. Halfway down the ridge, Caleb frowned. Something glinted in the distance metal, catching the sun. Then another. And another. Riders, a whole group of them, moving quickly across the foothills. He slowed Dusty, instinctively tense. Search parties weren't common unless something serious had happened. As the riders came closer, the Sinclair brand on their horses became unmistakable, a bold S, burned into the leather of saddlebags and bridles. Caleb never imagined they were searching for her. The moment the riders spotted Elena, their shouts echoed across the snow. "Miss Sinclair! Miss Sinclair!" The lead rider dismounted before the horse had even fully stopped, running toward her with wild relief. "Thank the heavens we found you," the man cried. "Your father's been nearly broken with worry." Caleb's breath lodged painfully in his throat. "Miss Sinclair?" Elena slid off the horse slowly, guilt flickering across her face as the men crowded her. Caleb stared, frozen. As realization washed over him, Elena wasn't just some traveler. She wasn't a merchant's daughter. She wasn't someone passing through. She was Elena Sinclair, heiress to the Sinclair ranching empire, the powerful dynasty that controlled nearly half the grazing territory. Her name carried weight, influence, fortune beyond anything Caleb had ever touched. His heart stumbled painfully. The men fussed over her, draping blankets around her shoulders, checking for injuries. She tried to push them away, stepping toward Caleb instead. "Caleb," she began, voice urgent, eyes pleading, but he stepped back. All the little mysteries now made sense. Her fine coat, her guarded answers, the way she carried herself with quiet authority. And all at once, Caleb felt foolish, out of place, like a man who dared to hold the sun only to realize it was never meant for his hands. "You're a Sinclair," he said quietly, unable to hide the hurt threading through his voice. Elena's throat tightened. "I was going to tell you." "When?" His voice wasn't angry, just stunned. "Before or after your men came looking for you?" She flinched at that. She had feared this moment, and now it was unfolding exactly as she dreaded. "I didn't want you to treat me differently," she said, stepping closer. "I just wanted to be me." The riders were watching, confused but curious. Caleb felt their eyes on him, measuring, judging, wondering why their heiress was trying so hard to speak to a cowboy with dust on his boots and nothing in his pockets. He forced a nod, swallowing the ache rising in his chest. "I'm glad you're safe," he said simply. Then he turned away for Elena. That hurt more than the cold, more than the storm, more than anything. The blizzard had passed. But something far more painful now stood between them, the truth of who she was, and who he wasn't. The return of Elena Sinclair was the biggest news the territory had seen all winter. Not because she was the heir to the richest ranching empire for 100 miles, people already knew that, but because of how she returned, half frozen, rescued by a drifting cowboy, and accompanied by a man no one had ever seen at her side before. By noon the next day, the story spread like wildfire. Some folks told it straight. Caleb Rowan saved Miss Sinclair in the blizzard. Others twisted it. He followed her tracks. Must have known she was a Sinclair. Probably hoping for a reward. Who risks their neck in a storm for free? It didn't matter that none of those people had stood in that deadly wind. It didn't matter that Caleb had heard her cries before knowing who she was. Rumors didn't care about truth. They only needed something to chew on. Caleb, who had never sought attention a day in his life, found himself in the center of talk he wanted no part of. When he entered the saloon for a drink, conversations hushed. When he rode into town for supplies, curious glances followed him. Some smiled, calling him a hero. Others smirked, whispering words like opportunist and lucky fool. He ignored them, or tried to. He wasn't good with people staring at him. And he was worse with people assuming things about him he didn't deserve. But none of that compared to the ache that settled in his chest. Whenever he remembered the look on Elena's face as he walked away from her the morning she was foundshock hurt, something like grief. Still, what could he do? She was a Sinclair. He was him. They lived in different worlds, separated not by miles, but by money, power, and expectation. Caleb threw himself back into work at the small ranch that had offered him temporary employment before the storm. He mended fences, fed cattle, repaired wagons, anything that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. But no matter how hard he worked, he couldn't silence the memory of Elena's soft voice in that cabin. The way she'd listened to him like she truly cared. Meanwhile, miles away at the Sinclair estate, Elena faced a different storm. Her father, Clayton Sinclair, was relieved beyond measure to have her home. But relief quickly turned into frustration. "You should have never ridden out alone," he said, pacing the study. "What were you thinking? What would have happened if that cowboy hadn't found you?" Elena defended herself calmly. "He did find me. He saved my life, Father." Clayton huffed. Yes, and I'm grateful, but the territory already has opinions about this situation. You know how quickly stories spread." Elena stiffened. "I don't care what they think." Her father stopped pacing. "But you need to." And then came the comments she expected but hated hearing. "A Sinclair must be careful. You cannot attach yourself to drifters. People will assume he wants your money. Men will assume they have access to your name." Her jaw tightened. They weren't talking about Caleb, they were talking about what they feared Caleb might want. What they expected from any man who wasn't from their world. But she knew him better than that. She'd seen his sincerity. She'd felt his humility, his quiet strength. And she would not let gossip decide her future. That night, after everyone had retired, Elena stepped out onto the porch. The sky was clear, stars scattered like lanterns across a velvet sheet. Somewhere beyond the hills, Caleb was working alone. Thinking she had deceived him, believing they had no place in each other's lives. She wasn't going to let it end like that. The next morning, Elena saddled her horse herself. No guards, no advisors, no entourage. When the foreman asked where she was going, she answered plainly. To speak with the man who risked his life for mine, because kindness wasn't something she would allow to be overshadowed by wealth. Because she would not let Caleb drift away believing her silence meant dishonesty, because some distances were worth crossing no matter how large the territory, no matter how loud the rumors. She rode out with one hope burning inside her, to tell Caleb the truth about her name, her heart, and what she wanted, which was him. Caleb didn't expect anyone to visit the small ranch where he worked, least of all her. He'd risen before dawn, as he always did, feeding the cattle while the sky still held the last traces of night. The cold bit at his fingers, but he welcomed the sting. It kept him focused, kept his mind from drifting back to the cabin. And to her, he was hauling a bale of hay toward the corral when he heard the unmistakable sound of approaching hooves. Slow, steady, deliberate. He straightened, curiosity tugging at him. Visitors were rare out this way, but when the rider crested the hill, sunlight catching on familiar dark hair and an even more familiar posture, Caleb's breath caught. Elena she reined in her horse a few feet from him. She looked nothing like the half-frozen stranger he'd carried through a storm. She wore a fitted riding coat, fine gloves, and confidence like a cloak. But her eyes, those were the same, honest, searching, a little guarded, a little hopeful. Caleb removed his hat, unsure what to say. "Miss Sinclair." She winced as if the name stung. "Elena," she corrected gently. "Please." He nodded stiffly, though the distance between them felt suddenly wider than the open plains. "I wanted to see you," she said, dismounting. "To explain." "To talk," Caleb hesitated. "There ain't much to say, ma'am. I'm glad you're safe, truly. But you've got your world, and I've got mine. No hard feelings." Her eyes softened with something like pain. "Is that really what you believe? That I came all this way just to tell you goodbye?" He swallowed. "Did you come to offer thanks? A reward?" Her expression cracked hurt, disbelief, something deeper. "Is that what you think of me?" Caleb set the hay down, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "I don't think anything bad of you. I know how it looks. Folks talk. Your family, well, they're not wrong. A man like me ain't got business mixing with someone like you." She stepped forward. "Caleb, you risked your life for me. Not because of my name, not because of my fortune, because that's the kind of man you are. And that's exactly why I'm here." The sincerity in her words hit him harder than the blizzard wind had. Still, he backed away a step. "What do you want from me?" Her voice wavered, but only for a heartbeat. "I want the man who stayed awake all night keeping the fire alive. I want the man who listened when I spoke, who didn't treat me like a name or a fortune or a title. I want the man who saved me without knowing who I was." Caleb exhaled slowly, his heart thudding against his ribs. "Elena, I'm just a cowboy. A broke one at that. You've got the whole territory in your hands. And you think that matters to me?" She moved closer, close enough he could see the softness in her eyes, the quiet strength she'd hidden behind her surname. "You didn't treat me differently when you thought I was nobody," she said. "So I refuse to treat you differently because of what you don't have." A long silence stretched between them, filled with possibility, fear, and something warm that neither could deny. Caleb lifted his gaze, meeting hers. "Your father won't approve." "Then he'll learn," she replied, voice steady. "I own half this territory, Caleb, but I choose who stands beside me." She held out her hand not as an heiress, not as a Sinclair, but as the woman he'd pulled from the snow, the woman who'd shared a fire with him in a forgotten cabin, the woman who'd listened to his dreams with more interest than anyone ever had. Caleb looked at her hand for a long moment, then reached out and took it, not because he felt worthy, but because, for once, he allowed himself to want something, and because she had already chosen him. They stood together as the winter wind swept across the plains. No longer strangers bound by circumstance, but two souls who had found something rare and fierce in the heart of a deadly storm, a love strong enough to cross fortunes, lift burdens, and defy every whisper in the territory. And this time, Caleb wasn't walking away.